Welcome. Today we're diving into the life of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Trying to go a little deeper than just the surface, really get to know the man behind the music.
Yeah, I think that's what's fascinating, right? We often just hear the name Mozart, and everybody knows, he's one of the greatest composers of all time, but we're trying to dig a bit deeper.
Absolutely. We have a few biographical sources here looking for those little details, the things that really give us a sense of who he was, what he went through, and how he achieved what he did.
Exactly. I mean, he really left an undeniable mark on Western music, but I think sometimes it's easy to get lost in the sheer scale of his accomplishments. You forget about the person who created it all.
That's what we're here to uncover. To begin, let's go back to Mozart's childhood, shall we?
Let's do that. I mean, it's a childhood that almost reads like a fairy tale, right? Born in Salzburg, Austria, to a family steeped in music. His father, Leopold, was a skilled violinist and composer himself.
And he recognized his son's extraordinary talent early on.
Oh, absolutely. Leopold wasn't just a father. He was Mozart's first teacher, a mentor. You could say he was dedicated, even demanding at times, and he really shaped young Mozart's career.
The stories about his childhood are remarkable. Picking out chords on the harpsichord at 3, composing short pieces at 4. By 5, he was writing down full compositions.
It's incredible. His sister, Nannerl, often talked about it. It wasn't just talent. He was consumed by music. It was a passion that his father, with his own ambition, really nurtured.
Do you think young Mozart felt the pressure of those expectations at all?
I think it's something to think about for sure. Just before Mozart turned 6, Leopold took him and Nannerl on a tour of Europe. Both of them musically gifted. They spent 3.5 years traveling. Imagine that. In the 18th century, going all over Europe, they even performed for royalty.
It must have been an overwhelming experience for such a young boy.
I think so. You can't imagine the discipline it took. Travel back then was rough, but Mozart just endured it.
Those experiences must have shaped his musical development. What about his meeting with Johann Christian Bach in London?
The youngest son of Johann Sebastian Bach, you mean? What a meeting of musical minds across generations.
Yes, Mozart was just a child, but he was captivated by Bach's style. You can hear the influence in some of his early symphonies.
It's incredible, isn't it? His ability to learn and adapt, to take in the techniques of a master like Bach and make them his own.
And it wasn't just performing. These travels exposed Mozart to different musical traditions, different styles, different approaches to composition.
I think that's key to understanding Mozart's versatility. He wasn't limited to one genre or style. He took it all in and blended those influences to create something entirely new.
Which leads us to another chapter in Mozart's life, his trips to Italy.
Ah, Italy. In the 18th century, it was the heart of operatic tradition. For any composer with operatic ambitions, a journey to Italy was almost a rite of passage.
And Mozart, even as a teenager, rose to the challenge. His operas from that time were acclaimed. His first one, Mitridate Riponto, composed for the carnival season in Milan, was a hit.
Just 14 years old, writing an opera that captivated audiences. It wasn't just youthful talent. He demonstrated a mastery of form, of dramatic expression that really set him apart.
It was during these years that his genius truly blossomed. He wasn't just copying, he was innovating, pushing the boundaries of what opera could be.
And there's the story, possibly a legend, of him transcribing Allegri's Miserere from memory. He heard it twice in the Sistine Chapel and was able to write it down perfectly. Whether it's true or not, it illustrates his extraordinary musical memory.
A testament to his ability to absorb and process complex musical information.
Speaking of great musical minds, we can't forget his meeting with Giovanni Battista Martini in Bologna.
A renowned music theorist and composer, one of the leading figures in Italian music at the time.
Mozart always sought to learn from the best, and he sought guidance from Martini. It's believed that they had in-depth discussions that enriched Mozart's understanding of counterpoint and composition.
It's fascinating to see how Mozart, with all his talent, never stopped learning, always seeking to improve.
It shows a certain humility, a recognition that even with extraordinary gifts, there's always more to learn.
But even with his triumphs in Italy, Mozart's return to Salzburg wasn't easy.
His time as a court musician under Prince Archbishop Hieronymus Colloredo, that was a complicated period. Lots of creative output, but also a lot of discontent.
His talent was undeniable, his reputation growing, but his relationship with Colloredo seems to have been strained.
From what we know from letters and accounts, Mozart felt restricted. His salary was low. He didn't have the freedom to compose operas as much as he wanted. It was frustrating.
You can imagine that frustration building up, a brilliant mind like his yearning for more creative control, more recognition, more opportunities to pursue his passion.
Exactly. And it was this yearning for artistic freedom that eventually led him to make a major decision. He decided to leave Salzburg and find his fortune elsewhere.
Vienna was calling, and Mozart was ready to answer.
I mean, Vienna back then, it was the place to be for music. Composers, performers, patrons, all flocking to the city.
The perfect environment for someone like Mozart, a young composer with big ambitions.
Oh, definitely. And he didn't waste any time either. Quickly established himself as a top pianist, playing in concert after concert. People were amazed by his technique, his improvisations.
But his reputation wasn't just as a performer. He was also gaining fame as a composer, right? He would play his own work, his concertos, sonatas, all of it.
Exactly. I can just picture it, elegant salons, candles flickering, the audience completely silent, waiting for Mozart to start playing.
It must have been something else. Some accounts describe people being moved to tears by his music. It wasn't just about skill, it was about the way he poured emotion into every note.
And it's during this time that we see him start to meticulously catalog his work. Maybe a sign that he understood his own legacy, that his music would be around for generations to come.
It's like he knew he was carving out a place for himself in musical history.
Possibly. He was definitely incredibly productive during these Vienna years. Some of his most famous pieces come from this period. Operas like Die Entführung aus dem Serail, The Marriage of Figaro. You can see his style evolving, the humor, the drama, all of it.
Let's not forget about the chamber music, the piano concertos. Those concertos were groundbreaking, so innovative. The way he blended the orchestra with the piano, it wasn't just a solo performance anymore. It felt like a conversation between the instruments.
It was totally new. He took the concerto and made it something much more dynamic.
But as his career was taking off, he was also living a whole personal life. He had a family, he fell in love. How did he juggle it all?
Well, his marriage to Constanze Weber, it was a big part of his life, of course. She was a singer and actually the sister of a woman he had been interested in earlier. But things weren't always smooth between them.
There are letters that hint at jealousy, family disagreements. Seems like it wasn't easy navigating their relationship with their careers in the mix.
Mozart's father, Leopold, he wasn't happy about the marriage at first. Added a whole other layer of tension to the relationship between Mozart and his father.
I suppose it's a story we see often, right? The conflict between a younger generation and the traditions of their parents.
In the end, they did get married, August 1782. They had 6 children together. Sadly, only 2 of them lived past infancy.
It makes you think about how fragile life was back then. Even for the most famous families, there was always the risk of losing children.
And even though Mozart's career was thriving, life wasn't easy for him. He struggled financially, especially toward the end of the decade.
The Austro-Turkish War hit Vienna's economy hard. Artists and musicians felt it too. It was difficult to find patrons.
We know from his letters that he was in debt. He wrote to friends asking for loans. It just shows that even a genius like Mozart had to face everyday problems, just like the rest of us.
It does make him seem more human, doesn't it? We see the real person behind the legend.
It reminds us that there's always more to the story. But even with all of this going on, Mozart kept composing. Some of his most powerful pieces, like Don Giovanni, came from this difficult time.
Don Giovanni is such a complex opera. The themes of morality, desire, the consequences of our actions. Maybe Mozart was pouring his own struggles into it.
I think that's very likely. Music can be a way to process what you're going through, and Mozart's music continues to resonate with us centuries later precisely because he was able to tap into those universal human experiences.
Yeah, and then his last few years, he was incredibly productive. Like he was trying to get as much done as he could.
It's really remarkable. As his health declined, his creative drive didn't seem to fade. He was composing his last 3 symphonies, including the Jupiter Symphony. That one, it just embodies everything about the classical period. Clarity, balance, perfect form.
And then there's the Magic Flute, a truly unique opera. Fantasy, symbolism, even Masonic themes. I'm not sure you could put it neatly into any one category.
He worked with his friend Emanuel Schikaneder on that one. Schikaneder wrote the libretto, managed the theater. They created something really special, something that goes beyond pure entertainment. There's a deeper message there, something more lasting.
People weren't sure what to think about it at first, but it quickly became one of Mozart's most loved operas. It's timeless, speaks to something deep within us.
Unfortunately, Mozart didn't have long to enjoy the success of the Magic Flute. He got sick, and by December of 1791, he was gone, only 35 years old.
Severe miliary fever, that's what the records say, but we still don't know exactly what caused his death. It's part of the mystery that keeps people fascinated by him, even now.
And then, of course, there's the Requiem. It was unfinished when he died. It adds a whole other layer of sadness to his passing.
The story of how it was commissioned is fascinating. An anonymous patron requested it. Some even thought that Mozart, knowing he was dying, was writing it for his own funeral.
It certainly gives the music a different feel. You hear the grief in it, a sense of acceptance, an awareness of the unknown.
And Mozart never stopped working on it, even as he got sicker. He was driven to complete it, this last testament to his genius. He was working on so much. It's almost hard to comprehend.
I know, right? And we're talking about major works here. It wasn't just little things he was churning out. He was composing a brand new opera at the same time.
La Clemenza di Tito, right? To celebrate Emperor Leopold II's coronation. But from what I've read, it seems like he wasn't all that excited about it.
It was a more traditional type of opera seria, they call it. Maybe Mozart felt a little stifled by the conventions, you know?
He always seemed to want to push the boundaries, try new things. But even so, he still produced a quality work.
He was a true professional, no doubt about it. He could adapt to any situation, any style.
But think about it. A full opera, a requiem filled with personal meaning and all his other commitments. It's overwhelming just thinking about it.
It really shows you how dedicated he was to his craft, how much discipline he had, the focus it took.
And in the middle of all that, he finished the clarinet concerto. That's a favorite of mine. You can really hear his grasp of the instrument, how to make it sing.
It's a beautiful piece, so lyrical. But there's also a sense of melancholy in it, almost a sadness.
Some people think that maybe, just maybe, the clarinet concerto reflects Mozart's own feelings at the time. That maybe he knew, on some level, that his time was running out.
That's a possibility. Music can be a way to express your deepest emotions, after all. Whether it's joy or sorrow, it all comes out in the music.
But it wasn't all doom and gloom, was it? There was the magic flute. That premiere must have been an incredible moment for him.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that opera has resonated with people for centuries. It's like a fairy tale, but it's also so much more than that. You've got symbolism, philosophical ideas, the whole Masonic element.
It really is hard to put it into a box. It's an opera, but it's also a story, a philosophical exploration, a celebration of music itself.
Mozart and Schikaneder, they were a perfect team. Schikaneder had this knack for theatricality, for knowing what the people wanted. They really struck gold with the magic flute.
It worked on so many levels. It entertained, it made you think, it really transported you.
It's a shame Mozart didn't have more time to enjoy that success. But his health kept getting worse. And that was it. December 1791.
35 years old. It's just tragic.
It really is. They said it was severe miliary fever, but the exact cause of death, it's still debated today. Part of the mystery that keeps people fascinated by Mozart, I suppose.
And the Requiem, left unfinished. What a poignant ending to his life. Absolutely. You almost can't help but imagine him composing it with the knowledge that his own death was approaching.
The way it was commissioned, it all adds to the story. An anonymous patron, all the secrecy around it, it fueled all sorts of speculation.
People wondered if Mozart thought he was writing it for himself. It adds a whole other dimension to the music. You hear the grief, the contemplation of what comes next. And to think, he kept working on it right to the end, even when he was so sick. Like he had to finish it. Maybe it was his final message to the world.
It's an incredible work. Mozart's pupil, Franz Aever-Süssmayr, he finished it based on Mozart's sketches. But you can't help but wonder what it would have sounded like if Mozart had completed it himself.
I suppose we'll never know. But the Requiem, it goes beyond Mozart, beyond even death itself. The themes of loss, of sorrow, and yet there's hope there too. It's something we can all connect with, even centuries later.
Mozart left such an impact on music. It's almost impossible to overstate it. He wasn't just composing. He was innovating, changing the landscape of music, pushing boundaries, creating whole new genres.
It's amazing to think that his music is still so popular, still so moving, all these years later.
I think it's because it speaks to something universal within us. The joy, the sorrow, the longing, the love, it's all there in his music.
We've really just scratched the surface today, but I hope it's given listeners a sense of who Mozart was. Beyond the genius, beyond the name everyone knows.
It's important to remember he was a real person with real struggles, real triumphs.
He had ambitions and dreams, failures and successes. He was complex.
He was human, just like the rest of us.
I think that's what makes his story so fascinating. And it's something to consider as you listen to his music.
Does knowing more about Mozart's life change how you hear his music? I think it's a question worth asking.
It certainly makes me appreciate his work even more. And I hope our listeners feel the same.